All the more reason we should be taking climate action in Canada, and we should diminish US power over our country by doing so. If they consider climate action to be a threat to their dominance, all the more reason we should do it. Relying on oil and gas for employment, energy, or revenue is a liability and a weakness the United States administration can exploit. We need a rapid build-out of renewable energy grid interties and battery storage across Canada now, and we need climate policies that help encourage that transition to be more rapid. Welcome to a special episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, part of a sub-series we are running on some Saturdays. We're calling this sub-series Sovereignty Saturdays, and a common theme to these episodes will be a focus on countering attempts by the US government to annex Canada with an environmental lens. If you haven't listened to them yet, I'll link to some previous episodes from this sub-series below in the description. Wealthy polluters have identified their main obstacle to continuing to profit from pollution, and that obstacle is democracy. This is as true in 2026 as it was in 2025. I'm your host, Connor Curtis, Head of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, and today's episode is about Venezuela, Trump's oil plans, and a threat to Canada. Almost exactly a year ago, in January 2025, Sierra Club Canada was one of the first organizations to warn that Trump was serious about his plans to annex Canada. In a recent end-of-year newsletter just before the holiday break in the new year, we followed up, warning that Trump was not only still serious about annexation, but that the US administration would use soft power through oil and gas corporate lobbying to try and erode Canada's resolve and sovereignty. It has only been a few weeks since, but what has happened since in Venezuela this January 2026 mirrors that same approach that we warned about. The US has replaced Venezuela's leader, Nicolás Maduro, with a new leader from the same regime, democracy not included, because the new leader, Delcy Rodríguez, is friendly with US oil and gas interests. They built a relationship with her and directly recommended her as a replacement. Obviously, Canada and Venezuela are not comparable governments, but this doesn't matter because the US administration does not view Canada as different. To them, both countries, Venezuela and Canada, are to be annexed. The US also said recently it is open to using military force to conquer Greenland. There is a low risk that our Prime Minister will be physically kidnapped and replaced by a more capitulant subordinate, for now, but pressure is being put on our government by oil and gas interests to stop resisting US influence, and to stop climate action, which would help us in Canada become more independent of the US. Oil and gas interests tied to the US are framing themselves as acting in Canada's national interest when they are actually undermining it. The more naive corners of our government have largely bought into that framing. Oil and gas interests are also at their old game, using breaking news to push for a West Coast oil pipeline in Canada. But here's the thing. If oil development took place at a greater degree in Venezuela, it would increase future oil oversupply in the global market, making a new West Coast oil pipeline even less economically viable. And we covered in the past just how uneconomically viable such a West Coast oil pipeline would be even without more Venezuelan oil flooding the market. More likely, though, is that the US actions in Venezuela are ultimately about funneling cash from US taxpayers to oil and gas corporations, as well as making the US president and his friends richer in the short term via them literally taking barrels of oil from Venezuela and selling it on the market while retaining control of the resulting income. As The Guardian reports, Donald Trump has suggested US taxpayers could reimburse energy companies for repairing Venezuelan infrastructure for extracting and shipping oil. All of this also helps oil and gas corporations keep up the false narrative that oil and gas demand will continue to increase for decades, a narrative that helps them make as much profit as possible in the short term before demand inevitably fades, and to collect taxpayer subsidies in the process. It is the appearance, not the reality of future demand, that matters to these oil and gas corporations, which is why oil and gas interests are promoting contradictory stories about oil and gas expansion both in Venezuela and elsewhere in places like Alberta. The stories might contradict practically, because there wouldn't be enough demand for oil from one of them, let alone both, but both stories support the false narrative of demand growth. And that false narrative, again, is what's important to them in the short term. Trump claims he briefed oil companies about his plans in advance of bombing Venezuela. Sources with a few relevant oil corporations denied they were briefed, but then that is what a climate-denying corporation would do if they had met with Trump: deny it. Trump's new 2025 national security strategy reveals the U.S. plans to use soft power, including private sector influence, to exert influence over other countries like Canada. The strategy mentions oil and gas and tech sectors in particular as tools for expanding U.S. influence, as well as the financial sector, and specifically declares climate action in other countries to be a threat to U.S. dominance. And this podcast is going to deal mostly with the oil and gas sector, but it is important to note you have to watch for corporate lobbying influence from the tech sectors and the financial sector as well in this regard. All the more reason we should be taking climate action in Canada, and we should diminish US power over our country by doing so. If they consider climate action to be a threat to their dominance, all the more reason we should do it. Relying on oil and gas for employment, energy, or revenue is a liability and a weakness the United States administration can exploit. We need a rapid build-out of renewable energy grid interties and battery storage across Canada now, and we need climate policies that help encourage that transition to be more rapid. But in case you missed it, Mark Carney has been taking speech ideas from a billionaire-founded organization called Build Canada, linked to oil and gas interests, and the tech entrepreneur Tobias Lutke, who famously said Canada should not hit back in response to US tariffs and characterized Trump's initial demands as reasonable. The Canadian government has even gone further, embedding 50 corporate leaders into key government roles, including defense, on the advice of Build Canada. Is the Prime Minister getting his information from the right people? Or is he listening to the sort of clueless bros who trust a deregulated free market alone to protect Canadian sovereignty? Taken in isolation, this incident might be easily written off, but there's also the recent unnecessary scrapping of climate policies for a now useless industrial carbon price in Alberta, because Alberta basically undermined the climate price within a week of the new pipeline MOU. The scrapping of climate policies included the weakening of anti-greenwashing laws that simply prevented oil and gas corporations from lying to the Canadian public and helped safeguard our democracy in the process. The Canadian federal government's decision to add the US-owned SLISM's LNG project, a project backed by the Friends of Trump, to its list of major projects is also something that stands out, as are the rumors that within Natural Resources Canada, NRCan, criticism of oil and gas economics has been silenced. NRCan's failure to answer journalists on sustainable jobs questions stands out as well, and then there's the NRCan cuts that will harm our ability to protect Canadians from floods and wildfires. So it's not an isolated incident. Oil and gas interests eager to strengthen ties with the US are behaving like a Trojan horse for Donald Trump's pro-fossil, anti-climate politics. The four companies that represent 80% of Canadian oil sands production are 73% foreign-owned, 60% American-owned. They're sending a large share of their profits to their shareholders in the United States, even as they lobby to weaken Canadian climate policy, as the Energy Mix recently covered. And there isn't even much benefit to Canada from existing oil and gas infrastructure. As the T reported recently, Trans Mountain's profitability looks to be an accounting illusion. The only reason Trans Mountain looks like it's making profit is that most of the debt has been moved off their books, said Thomas Gunton, a professor and director in resource and environmental planning at Simon Fraser University. It's a misrepresentation of finances on this project. The T continues to report that so long as its oil company tenants don't go bankrupt in the next 20 years, Trans Mountain has a committed, albeit partial, income stream. But if the gamble goes wrong, taxpayers could be left holding the bag. No matter how much we build Canada, if we do not address the fundamental forces of inequality and environmental deregulation that have led the US on the path towards oligarchy, we will simply hand over Canada to US oligarchy the slow way. If we do not call out leaders when they are being sent in bad directions, then we have already lost. No matter who you support, remember, hope does not come from leaders, it comes from you. You are not alone. Contrary to what you have heard, people do still care about climate change. So, as an action item for this week, I'm going to encourage you to give your MP a call and tell them you want a renewable way forward, and that the Prime Minister has to stop listening to oil, gas, and tech interests that are trying to undermine our sovereignty here in Canada. I'll put a link to where you can find your MP's contact information in the description. There's also going to be a link in the description to sources for today's episode and a full page that you can share with this as a write-up. Thank you so much for listening, and continue to be hopeful even in these moments when that hope can be hard to find. It really does not only benefit yourself, but hopefully inspires others. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.